Good on you, I know. Oh, good.
Are we live? Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the London Archives. My name is Tom. I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at the Archives, and this is my colleague, Jack. Jack will be looking after the live stream, so that's what Jack's doing there, which gives you a clue that this is what we call a hybrid event. So as well as the event that's going on here in person, we've got the audience at home as well. So welcome to those of you in person, and welcome to those of you at home as well. I think maybe an especially warm welcome to those of you who got here on Tube Strike Day. We were expecting slightly more, but I don't blame any of you, particularly if you joined us from home instead, for not battling with the tube today. But thank you for those of you that were able to join us in person. It's most appreciated. So just to say, we will take questions at the end. Please feel free, if you're visiting, joining us from home, to pop the questions in the chat as we go along. Any issues with the sound or picturing that, please pop that in the chat as well, and we'll do our best to work out whether that's something our end or something local. And yes, questions from the room as well will be taken at the end as well. A few familiar faces in the room, so welcome back, and quite a lot of new faces as well. So I always, when there's a few new people in the room, I feel the need to start with a bit of a disclaimer, which is I'm not an expert on what we're talking about today. So my job is to sort of know a little bit about a lot in the things that we have in our collections, and we have quite a lot of things in our collections. So I'm very happy to take questions, comments, and even corrections at the end. I should say as well that this is my sort of second most nerve-wracking topic, Shakespeare, because there's an awful lot to know, and a lot of people know a lot more about it than I do as well. So if I get any of the details wrong, as I say, happy to be corrected, but we'll do that at the end. And if I don't know the answer to any questions, there's a good chance I can help you find out, because after all, we are in an archive. So that being said, we will commence. So this is part of our ongoing talks program that we have here that links to what we call our iconic display area, and that's the area, if you've not found it, that's through the main exhibition space on the right hand side. And presently in the display area we have what we call the Shakespeare's Deed, which we'll be talking about in a lot more detail today. We have a very charming early map of London called Civitas Londinium, and we have a book of Shakespeare's plays owned by the poet John Keats. All of this will be on display until the 2nd of October, when it will be replaced by an exhibition called Spotlight on Musical, which in turn links to a special event on musicals on the Saturday, the 1st of November. If you're not joining us in person, or indeed you want to look at any of those documents after the exhibition has come down, both of those are available digitally, either on the London Picture Archive or on our main catalogue website. You can view them both in various formats digitally as well. So the exhibition itself puts together, I think most interestingly for my personal taste, it puts together a documentary source, so the Shakespeare Deed that you can see in the middle there, with a topographical source with a map on the left-hand side as you look at it. And that's really how I intend to proceed for our time together this afternoon, to compare what we know about some of the documentary evidence, most of it I should say not kept here at the London Archives, with some of the topographical sources that we do keep here at the London Archives, and use this to inform us a little bit about what we can deduce, and perhaps more importantly, what we realistically can't deduce about Shakespeare's time in London, some of the places he frequented, and what the city that he lived and worked in might have looked like at the time. So, as I say, one of the pleasures and perils of this job is the sort of erudition of the audience. So, if I tell you that the deed in question there recounts a sale that was made in 1613 of a property near Blackfriars, many of you will know that Shakespeare died in 1616, so it might take us a little bit of time to get to the deed itself. But I hope if you bear with me, the context that we set will be kind of interesting and enjoyable along the way. So there's always a challenge I think there's a dual challenge when researching Shakespeare. One is that there's a huge amount of scholarship available, and there's actually a very tiny amount of documentary evidence available to sort of base that scholarship on. We shouldn't be surprised by this. Finding details about anyone's life who lived over sort of 400 years ago is tricky. not as many records were kept then as there are now, and not all the records that were kept do survive. So there are many gaps in the life of Shakespeare that we can't account for in the documentary record. But I say, not something I think we should read too much into, although some people, of course, do, either kind of creating conspiracy theories, as I would deem them, or perhaps sort of allowing their imaginations to get ahead of the evidence. So what we can say is that the period of 1585 to 1592 are Shakespeare's lost years. We know that in 1585 his twins, Judith and Hamlet, were born, and we know he effectively disappears from the record until 1592, when he's famously described as an upstart crow. This was an insult, perhaps the insulting part that hasn't fully sort of translated in the test of time, by one in a book published by one Robert Greene, known as Greene's Groatsworth of Wit. And this is the only earliest known allusion to William Shakespeare as a playwright. I say allusion because he didn't actually name Shakespeare himself, but from the talk of a shake scene, from various other kind of incidental details, it was known who Robert Greene was in fact insulting at the time. It's thought that Shakespeare took this somewhat personally. This was particularly as sort of the early part of his career, and it's something Shakespeare himself alludes to. It is much later in his life, when he's in fact rather successful, and as posterity suggests, one of the most successful playwrights ever. So we know that, so we can sort of reasonably deduce that if he's being sort of successful enough to be kind of insulted in 1592, he must have appeared on the London scene. It must have been the London scene sometime in the 1580s. London was at this point by far the biggest city in the country, and really, if you wanted to make your fame and your fortune in the theatre business, there's really no other place where you would want to be. So at some point in his early life, Shakespeare comes to London to sort of chase his fame and fortune. It was not without risk doing so. London was a perilous place at the time. Plague, violence, ill health, all of those things were kind of common occurrences for Londoners. And indeed, it was only the kind of steady influx of sort of economic migrants to the capital that kept the population from shrinking at this time. So we know that Shakespeare was sort of working in London in 1592. And our first sort of strong evidence of where he might have lived, where he might have been based, comes from tax records, which put William Shakespeare in the parish of St Helens, Bishopsgate, and that is the location that is marked on the map here. Although it's sort of been broadly known, as I understand this scholarship, it's been broadly known that this has been true for some time. The figure that, if you want to find more about this chapter in Shakespeare's life, that I'd suggest looking up is Geoffrey Marsh. Geoffrey Marsh is the author of Living with Shakespeare, and also I forget his exact job title, but he's a sort of senior curator of the Victoria and Albert Museum in their theatre collections. And he is very specific. He places Shakespeare's house at 35 Great St Helens, and this is a site right next to St Helens Church that's today occupied by an office block. And this would have been a small area at the time. The parish of St Helens would have been the best way to think of it would be, it was about twice the size of Trafalgar Square. So a very small part of London. As a bit of a digression, I should probably explain the map that we have on the screen here in front of us. So this is an extract from Civitas Londinium, and this is the same map that is currently on display in our Iconics area. It's one of my favourite things that we have in the collection. It appears slightly different in person than it does reproduced in this image. In person, it has more of that kind of parchment sepia tone. So there has been some sort of digital manipulation of the image that we can see on screen, which is whitening out the background, which makes it far more legible and far more readable. So the map, as in the physical map, dates to the 1630s, but the London it depicts, for the large part, is probably around sort of 1560, 1570. We can't say for sure, but from certain clues within the map, we can make sort of that educated deduction that's the London it represents. So though I've sort of largely illustrated today's talk with this map, because it's on display, it's not an exact link up with Shakespeare's time, but actually there's only a couple of other candidates anyway, so this is as good a choice as any, and it's one you will see in most of the scholarship used to illustrate this time period. A few other things that's probably just worth mentioning before we crack on and get back into sort of Shakespeare's life in London is that this is sort of unusual for a map from sort of a modern perspective, in that the view that it has is a sort of 3/4 view. So we're not looking directly ahead like a plan view, it has this sort of nice tilting angle. What this does, it means that you can see more accurately the topography. That's sort of the way we talk about the actual buildings that exist. And many of the buildings on this map, Civitas Londinium, are what's the word? That's accurate, that's not quite the word. They are done sort of uniquely. They're designed to represent the thing they are, but many other are kind of uniform and kind of generic as well. So you always have to be a little bit careful about what features we can say, oh, it looked like that, or which ones are generic. But look, things like the cross there that's there, there's a good chance that would have been there, or at this time, or this time abouts. So we can see then, as I say, St. Helens there. That is roughly where Shakespeare lived. He's on the edge of the city of London, just south of Bishopsgate, which is itself to the north of the city. It would look very different, of course, today. It's not far from the Gherkin. It's very much in the bustling centre of the city. But there would have been a few things that were familiar to Shakespeare. If Shakespeare was to be alive again today, there would be at least a couple of things that were familiar to the Salts residents. And one of them is St. Helen's Church. This is the oldest image that I could find in our collection of St. Helen's Church. So it's still, over 100 years after Shakespeare lived there, but actually this is very much how it would look. It looks today. Fortuitously, it survived the Great Fire. It survived the Blitz. Sadly, it was damaged during the IRA bombing of I think early 90s. That particular one, but I'm open to correction on that one. But it's still something that you can recognise. You can recognise today. When we think of Shakespeare and the theatre and sort of his life in London, I think the place our mind goes to first is of course Southwark and the Globe's Theatre on the south bank of the river. But the early years of his career, his plays and himself, because of course he was an actor and a playwright, were not being performed at the Globe. His early plays were performed at the theatre, literally called the theatre, somewhat confusingly and quite tricky when you try and do online searches for it as well. The theatre was the country's sort of first purpose-built playhouse, and was built in 1576 by the actor James Burbage. As we can see on the map here, it was located outside the City of London, and this was for sort of at least a couple of very sound reasons. First of all, you could get away with a lot more outside the city than you could within it. The sort of levels of government and the kind of the forms of government were very different then to they are now. Government was a lot more local, so different parishes, different cities, different boroughs would have different laws, different regulations. And one interesting pattern and theme that we see in the history of London is things going on just outside the city that you can't do in the city, but the people inside the city want to take part in. Famously theatres, but also various sort of noisy and sort of smelly trades, prostitution, sex work, all those sorts of things tended to take place on the outskirts or outside the city, but not too far from the city itself. And so it was that the theatre opened in Shoreditch, just outside the north wall of the city, say for these kind of legal and regulatory reasons, and no doubt for economic reasons as well. As you can see, there's more space, it's less developed outside the walls than within, so it's kind of just a cheaper option as well. The image on the screen here is based on on Civitas Londinium, again the map that's on display. The thorough review will note at the bottom it's described as the Agas map of early modern London. That's an older That's an older name that is given to the map. Until very recently, we called it the Agass map. That was an attribution to Ralph Agass, who was the antiquarian that was thought to produce the map. That's now thought to be a sort of a spurious attribution. So what we tend to say these days is Civitas Londinium, but a lot of references still use Agass map as well. And I often find myself calling the Agass map as well quite a lot of the time. And just for completeness' sake as well, it's also sometimes called the woodcut map as well, a reference to how it was produced. And then the image that we can see here is a digital version of the version of the copy of the Civitas Londinium that is held here at the London Archives, but it's been adapted and sort of augmented by the University of Victoria in their excellent website, the map of early modern London. If you're interested in old maps, if you're interested in this period, I can't recommend that site enough, because what you can do is you can have a look at the map and browse around it and scroll around it, but it also has various other features which allow you to kind of get extra information to annotate the map as well. And one of the things that's really very helpful is you can click on various buttons and it will tell you where various things are. And so what we can see on the screen here, the purple area, that is Shoreditch in the early modern period, and that yellow circle, which is actually highlighting nothing, is the location of the theatre when it opened in 1576. This map, as I say, was surveyed earlier than that. Hence the theatre not being on it. If you can remember back to the previous image that I showed you, we saw Bishopsgate, St Helens Bishopsgate, and right at the top of the previous map we could see the Bishopsgate itself with a different spelling there, BU sort of double SHOPPES, but Bishopsgate nonetheless. So, and then we can follow that road up and get to the Shoreditch. So we can reasonably sort of surmise that one of the reasons that Shakespeare chose to live in St Helens Bishopsgate is it was only a 10-minute walk from his place of work. Geoffrey Marsh has further gone on to suggest that one of the attractions of St Helens was, despite it being right in the centre, it was probably quite a quiet location, and it might have given him some sort of peace and quiet to get on with his writing. But as with many things in the world of Shakespeare, that is sort of a supposition and an elaboration, not something that we can in any way definitively prove. So although Shakespeare's career, of course, starts with the theatre, he's most famously associated with the Globe Theatre on the South Bank in Southwark, or the Liberty of the Clink, as it was sometimes known at the time. A liberty being, again, one of these slightly arcane forms of governance where different rules applied than the city, and the Clink being the prison that was on the South Bank, giving its name to this particular area. So the theatre moves to the South Bank in 1598. I do mean that quite literally. So the owners of the theatre building itself were Burbage and the acting company. They got into a dispute with their landlord who owned the land itself, and they got the impression that they were going to be sort of frozen out of their lease and their building co-opted. So as the story goes, probably somewhat embellished in the tale, on Christmas 1598, in the dead of night, they take the theatre apart and sneak it down south, and then re-erect it. The story is that they did it in one night. That's probably impossible, I think it's safe to say, but from kind of other, again, kind of contextual and circumstantial evidence, it's safe to assume that by the summer of 1599, the Globe Theatre was thriving again on the south bank of the Thames. And this is probably, when we think of Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, this is the location that we think of the most. The south bank of the Thames, just outside the city. You could use the cross London Bridge, which you can see on the right hand side, to get to the various entertainments, or indeed you could use any of the various boats and small boats to cross the river. This was sort of very much the place to be at the time. so we sort of know for sure that the globe itself moved to Southwark in 1599, and it's commonly assumed but not proven that William Shakespeare made a similar move himself in the years preceding. Like all things Shakespeare, we have to sort of stack little bits of evidence together, textual and otherwise, to kind of reach this conclusion. So there are 4 pieces of evidence that I have found sort of commonly cited that suggest that this move was made by Shakespeare, as I say, in the years preceding 1599. The first is a certain amount of common sense. It would be more convenient, of course. I hasten to say this, as when we were struggling to get around in London today with the tube strike, actually it was quite difficult to get around London even in Shakespeare's time. The population was a lot less, only about sort of half a million or so, maybe a little bit over, but it was very crowded. Traffic was bad, so it would make sense after hard days of acting, writing, I think directing as well. I think I'm safe to say that he'd want to live close, reside close to his place of employment. And we do know that some of the other actors in Shakespeare's troupe, the Chamberlain's Men, and later the King's Men, did live in the St Saviour's parish, which is next to which is nearby the Globe. But Shakespeare himself doesn't appear on some of the records you would expect him to, particularly the token books, which show who's permitted to take communion in that parish. So he might. But there's plenty of reasons that he might not appear in those books, which don't suggest he didn't. It's that sort of classic thing of evidence of absence isn't evidence of absence isn't evidence of absence. Get that the right way round. Another sort of argument that's made to sort of locate Shakespeare in Southwark at this time is from sort of scholarship from Malone in 1796 and Collier in 1841, both of whom claim to have access and sort of cite documents which make definitive proof of this, which have now been lost. So that's something I think we can probably put very little weight on. Stronger evidence comes from the subsidy and pipe rolls. These actually I don't think I mentioned. These are the same pieces that give us the evidence that place William Shakespeare in St Helens, and these are records of taxes. In particular, they're a record of a tax called the lay subsidy. The lay subsidy is a tax that the monarch would levy when they sort of done something expensive and needed a bit more money. In this case, it was wars in Ireland that this extra tax was being raised for. And Shakespeare appears to have not paid this tax, and that's something we do see quite a lot. Sometimes he is characterized as a tax evader. Again, not much evidence, but there are several accounts of several suggestions he didn't pay his tax. We don't know whether that's where he was delaying it. He paid it somewhere else. Lots of things. But anyway, he's basically accountable for the tax in 1596 in his St Helens Bishopsgate residence, but in the pipe roll recording the people liable to pay this tax in 1597 to 1598 has a note by the name William Shakespeare saying. Translating from the Latin, residing in Sussex, but I think we deduce Surrey from that. So he's residing in Surrey. Later on, there's an account that the tax matching Shakespeare's the amount he was meant to pay is paid by the Bishop of Winchester. The Bishop of Winchester was sort of in charge, to put it colloquially, of the liberty of the clink. So the supposition is that the Bishop of Winchester took the payment of the tax and then paid it on. That's the supposition there. Again, there could be other reasons why that happened. There are other things going on. There is a name William Shakespeare. It could have been a different William Shakespeare. There's nothing else to link that our William Shakespeare to the William Shakespeare that appears on that roll. It's an uncommon name, so we're probably safe enough in assuming that it was the William Shakespeare that we're interested in, but should note that is the only thing that ties William Shakespeare to St Helens, is that particular name. And also there might have been other reasons why the Bishop of Winchester took payment from Shakespeare in Southwark. It quite simply might have been he knew where to find him. He worked at the Globe, so they might have been able to find him there afterwards without him necessarily living there. There is sort of a slightly stronger piece of evidence, again somewhat circumstantial, which is called the Langley Writ, and the Langley Writ sort of implicate Shakespeare in a legal case. They're not directly involved, and as part of the kind of the text of that writ, again, it implies his residence in Surrey, but we can't be sure. And I should say at this point, Surrey started sort of south of the river. It's not where it is today. So again, there's a certain amount of deduction going there, and because we're deducing, obviously I can't plonk him on the map like I did in the previous examples. But as I say, one of the really nice things about this map of early modern London is that you can annotate the map, and although we can't know where Shakespeare possibly lived, of course, we can annotate the map, and we can see there where the globe would be there. And this sort of takes into this interesting question of what would Southwark have been like at the time? What can we kind of glean from the kind of visual sources that we have here at the archive, and in what ways might those visual sources lead us astray? So already we can say a map that was produced in 1570, but purported to be of London of 1630, doesn't have kind of things that we know are there from textual and archaeological evidence. So that's one question as well. There is some debate. So text is a bit small, but this says the bull baiting and the bear baiting. Although we know that these rather gruesome blood sports did take place on the South Bank, there's lots of kind of arguments against the fact that they took place in two separate purpose-built arenas. And actually, the plot thickens as we go on. So the image we have on the screen is called the Vischer panorama, and it was published in 1616. It's frequently used to illustrate sort of all things Elizabethan, many things Tudor. On many of the websites I use to help research this talk, this image is used to illustrate Shakespeare's London. And I should say there's nothing wrong with that. There are very few images from this time. This is a particularly kind of beautiful and evocative one. But we need to be careful when we take this as a work of geography, not a work of art, because if we learn a bit more about how this was made, it starts to think that any kind of sort of scholarly or kind of factual arguments based on Shakespeare's London will be on very shaky foundations indeed. So it's called the Vischer panorama, quite simply, because that's the name of the author. Klaus Vischer, who was a Dutch engraver and mapmaker. In all probability, Klaus Vischer never came to London. So the view that he's created, which I should say as well as an imaginary view, there's not someone sitting there at a particular position taking this view. In all likelihood, he never came to London, so the map was produced either from other map views that already existed, or from sketches done second-hand. And some scholarship suggests that it was based on an earlier view from 1570. So we can't put too much on it as a geographical reference. And there's a nice couple of points that there's a couple of things we can point out which make that point rather nicely. The first is actually, which you see very well in this image, is the Thames has been straightened out. It's a lot curvier than that across the whole panorama, and even at this point there'll be more of a bend, but it's been straightened out for the purposes of the artistic view. But perhaps more significantly, when it comes to maybe making sort of factual deductions based on this source, is evident on this image we have on the screen here. So this is from 1800, and it's an enlargement and adaptation of the Vischer panorama. This is something that you see an awful lot, and when I first started working in archives, I found it quite kind of confusing and head-scratching. I thought, oh, there's all these wonderful sources, but actually if you trace it back, there's a lot less than you think. They're kind of derivative and adapted. Now I think that's just part of the fun, but it gave me a bit of a challenge when I started out. So this is from 1800, but it's an adaptation of the Vischer panorama of a published date of 1616, probably 1570. And this is described as the Globe Theatre. So the image in the theatre in the foreground there is described as the Globe. And this image contradicts, or I should say, other evidence contradicts the veracity of this image. First, quite simply, this is an octagonal building. Archaeological evidence suggests that the globe was 20 sides. Perhaps that's splitting hairs, but it starts to kind of get those question marks in your head. Another thing to say was that this is a very kind of bucolic scene. It's quite genteel. Would be quite a nice place to be. in all odds, Southwark wasn't like this at the time. As we've heard, there was a certain amount of licentiousness that made the place attractive. It's a place where you went to do things you weren't allowed to do in the city. It was also a time when London was starting to expand. So here all the buildings seem very uniform, very neat, very well made. In all likelihood, they would have been more sort of ramshackle, hastily put up, something of that nature. So we can kind of question the mise en scene and the ambience that's been put out here. So if that one's not right, are there other sources that might be more accurate? So the other source that you see an awful lot to illustrate this period is something called the Holler Panorama, or the long view. This is a bit later already, so we're in 1640 when this is published, and this is published by the engraver Wenceslas Holler. Holler is commonly regarded as a master of his trade. He lived and worked in London, as well as sort of these long views. He was a map maker and an engraver as well. If you like this sort of thing, I thoroughly recommend putting a little search for him in our London Picture Archive or other online image spaces. They're really very beautiful works indeed. I personally don't feel the need to compare, but just for sort of completeness' sake, the Holler Panorama is generally seen as more accomplished and more accurate than the Vischer Panorama of the preceding years. So I was slightly disappointed when this was the best image I could find due to the quirks of our filing system. The resolution isn't perfect, and it's got this big watermark on it. So my apologies for that. So in my scurrying around on our file system, I thought I'm sure I can find a better picture. And I was quite happy when I found this. This is much clearer. This is much better. And then I'm glad that I didn't put this up uncritically. I'm going to give you guys a moment or two. What's wrong? It's very wrong with this picture. Anyone want to say it yet?
Is it the St Paul's Cathedral?
It is.
I noticed immediately that the one before was just a tower. This one looks like something like Renfrew maybe, or even a Baroque type.
Absolutely right, spot on. I'm not sure if the room might pick that up, but member of the audience there very rightly spotted. On the image on the right-hand side, St Paul's Cathedral looks rather different than it did in the previous one. It's this weird mix of kind of a Gothic body with this sort of bit of a dome and then a spire. St Paul's Cathedral doesn't look like this, never looked like this. So this is a reissue of the Holler Panorama from 1670 after the Great Fire of London. Print selling was good business. If you had something that still looked quite nice, you'd carry on using it. And this was one of the proposed designs for St Paul's Cathedral, or something approximating this, I should say, was one of the proposed designs for St Paul's Cathedral that was never built. But don't let that stand in the way of a bit of making money from some maps. And the reason I put that out is because, again, just to plant that seed of doubt and that mistrust in our sources in your head, particularly with these older sources, that we have to be careful because these are artistic, not sort of geographical or topographic records. So bear in mind we're in 1670, but the resolution is so much better on this one, and the left-hand section is unchanged from the 1640 issue. We can see the globe, and we can see the bear baiting on display here. And scholars believe that this is the first of all the panoramas. This is the first accurate placement of these buildings. But there is a mistake. The globe, you might just be able to make out the globe. This first one here, for the benefit of people at home, that's the one closest to the river, with the flag flying. The globe is marked as closest to the river, and here it's bear baiting away from the river. In fact, this is swapped round. These are the wrong locations. These are the wrong labels for approximately the correct locations. So what we're starting to I think really notice here is, say, our paucity of evidence, and how we have to do quite a lot with quite a little, and also sort of noting on how these images kind of start once and reappear and come down through the ages in various forms. That can be a bit tricky, but sometimes it's very helpful. So the image that we can see on the screen here is a sort of around about an 1800 reprint of the interior of the Swan Theatre from the middle of the 1590s, and this is the only sort of contemporary image we have of an interior of these theatres. It's of the Swan, not of the Globe, but this is the, as I understand it, this was heavily inspired the redesign of the reincarnation of the Globe in its sort of modern location on the South Bank here. So originally hand drawn by a Dutch traveller, and then became part of print culture and survived in that way. So please don't think I'm being too negative on this kind of repurposing and remixing of the various sort of print culture from the time. I couldn't help but show this if we're dealing with Shakespeare's London. This is slightly later. This is 1620. This is a whole other different type of source. We call this a manuscript map simply because it's made by hand. It's not printed, and this was made not for kind of the art world like the previous examples that we've seen. This map was made instead to illustrate a legal case, a legal dispute. In this case, between the residents of the borough of Southwark and the residents of the City of London. Well, they were lessees of the City of London, although their actual residence was outside the city on the south bank of the Thames. A little confusingly. We won't go into too much detail because it will sidetrack us. But what this map is basically showing is, say, a legal dispute, and the dispute was about this road here. So if you're in person, you can see where the laser pointer is. If you're at home, the left-hand side, the road that starts about halfway up the screen, there's a windmill, and then there's a left-hand turn. This was a road opened by the publicans and other sort of providers of hospitality of that top section of the map here, belonging to Southwark. They'd open this road to basically take a shortcut to their pubs, their hotels, to use the anachronistic term, and therefore taking trade away from the kind of existing establishments along London Bridge and on that way as well. And basically the City of London, so trying to defend its lessees, barred that road, but was eventually unsuccessful. They were taken to court and they had to open the road and pay the court cases. Why am I saying all this? Well, a couple of reasons. Firstly, this map reappeared in 1950, sort of when the appropriate edition of the Survey of London was being researched. So it's a nice sort of fun archival find. But it's thought to kind of correspond very well with the other source at the time, and the Globe is marked on it here. The Swan is marked on it here, and this is the Paris Gardens are marked on it here. So it gives us another kind of first-hand account of what it looked like. And I would put more trust in this account because it has been made for kind of a legal purpose. The point of this map is to show where things are, where the previous maps that we've seen are designed to kind of illustrate what things might have looked like, to kind of give a kind of a sense of the feel and the ambience. So we've speculated that Shakespeare probably certainly worked, but probably lived in Southwark in the 1590s. By 1604, we know that he is at least temporarily living back in the City of London, because there is a court case from 1612 which places him in lodgings in Silver Street in the City of London, and it's marked on the map here. Obviously, the big red circle there. So by 1604, Shakespeare is renting a room. He's lodging with the Mountjoys, who are a Huguenot family who make sort of fine hats and other items of clothing. It's quite interesting that he's sort of renting a room, that he's a lodger, because it points to, doesn't prove anything, but it points to an interesting aspect of his kind of his character and maybe his kind of preferences as well. By this point in his life, Shakespeare was successful and he was relatively wealthy. So it might seem a bit sort of down in his luck to be simply renting a room in somebody else's property. So in all likelihood, this was just sort of a ped de tete, and it might point to his sort of frugality. So we've seen him possibly avoiding his taxes. He had a reputation for being, we've deduced a reputation for being frugal from the sources. Indeed, there's some suggestion he was a rather hard-headed businessman. So we know there are accounts he was punished for basically buying up grain and food in sort of good harvest years to hoard it and sell it at high prices in famine years. It also might suggest that although his business life was in London, his family life was still in Stratford, because we know in 1597 he bought the grand, if dilapidated, new place in Stratford. So many scholars have suggested that really his investment in his property, his investment in his home life was in Stratford, and his London residences and London locations were simply sort of things of convenience. So, and I should say, to finish the point, that we appears to say he's living here in 1604, but the evidence for that is 1612, and this is again a court record in which William Shakespeare is deposed. That is, he's required to give evidence in the disagreement between in the Bellot Mountjoy dowry lawsuit of 11th of May 1612. Mountjoy was the father. Bellot was the son-in-law. Bellot claimed that his dowry wasn't properly, his wife's dowry wasn't properly paid, and he took him to court, and Shakespeare has to give evidence in that case. And we know this definitely is Shakespeare from his signature. That's one of 6 surviving Shakespeare's signatures. And this talk of Shakespeare's signatures, perhaps slightly overdue, brings us to Blackfriars and the Shakespeare deed, as we call it. So in 1613, on the 10th of March 1613, Shakespeare and 3 associates purchase a property in Blackfriars. It's the old gatehouse of the Blackfriars monastery. It's a Dominican priory, and their nickname was the Blackfriars. And the location of this is marked on the map here again by the big red circle. So we have obviously a record of this transaction. That's the deed that's on display here. That's part of our collection. And according to this deed, which is technically called a bargain of indenture of bargain and sale, we know that the gatehouse was adjacent to the King's Wardrobe on the east side, a plot of ground belonging to the widow Anne Bacon on the west, and a third wall was a brick wall that faced the street leading down to Puddle Wharf on the Thames. So I'll just point out some of those things on the map before we look at the deed itself. So Puddle Wharf is right at the bottom here, starting with the Thames. So you can see the bottom left-hand side of the map. There's a little boat. That's Puddle Wharf, which is sort of a medieval wharf or set of steps that was actually the way that the previous priory would access the Thames. The wardrobe is written in on the map, but hard to read. That says the wardrobe there with a P on the end to get that sort of plosive sound at the end. The King's Wardrobe is actually what it sounds like. It's where the king kept his clothes, but had so many of them they would require its own building. By this point, that wasn't the function of this building, but like is often the case, the name has stuck. We know that the purchase of the property included free entry through the gate in the yard, and access, and now I quote, to all and singular cellars, attics, rooms, lights, easements, profits, commodities, and any hereditaments whatsoever to the said dwelling house or tenant belonging or anywise appertaining. So the consensus view then is this was a sort of a business investment, this was a property investment, rather than any kind of sort of attempt to buy somewhere to live. Indeed, we're in 1613. Shakespeare himself would his kind of career and indeed his life is coming to a close now. He himself dies 3 years later in 1616. And then that brings us to the deed itself. As I say, we call it the deed. The technical term for this is an indenture of bargain and sale, and it records this property transaction that we heard. The deed came into the ownership of the City of London Corporation, which is the body that funds and manages the London Archives, in 1841, when it was purchased in an auction. The Folger Shakespeare Library is able to trace its documentary history back to 1768, when it was found amongst a bundle of deeds of title in a collection by one Reverend Fanshawe. In 1796, it was owned by one Albany Wallace, who was a London lawyer, and in 1841, it was bought in auction for £145. It was condemned as a waste of money at the time by one member of the Common Council, which is sort of the elected body that supervises the workings of the City of London Corporation, who described it as a most wasteful and prodigal expenditure. Now, to be fair, £145 was a lot more then than it is now. Currency conversions are notoriously tricky, but as an indication, the National Archives currency converter suggests that £145 at the time would buy 9 horses, 27 cows, 219 stones of wool, 72 quarters of wheat, 725 days of skilled labour, or more prosaically, about £8,500. And before anyone asks what it's worth today, it's not for sale, so it doesn't have a price. So, as I say, this is called an indenture, indenture of bargain and sale. An indenture consists of 2 identical or nearly identical copies that would be written out on a single sheet of parchment and then cut in half, and each party to the transaction would keep a section, and that is why at the top you can see this wavy line. They're cut in such a way that if you put them back together, it shows the sort of the authenticity of the document. So one part would be kept by sort of Shakespeare and his, in this case they were trustees rather than co-purchasers, and the other would be kept by the vendor, one Henry Walker. I say identical, actually nearly identical. You only sign the bit that you're giving to the other party, and actually you can just make it out. I didn't do a very good job with my cropping, but you can see there's this crossed out section here. So there was a clause that was put in, realised it was out of date, that's crossed out on the copy that we have, and then doesn't appear on the other copy, which I should say is in the national. No, it's not. I've forgotten where it is. That's really annoying. It's in the Vulgar Shakespeare Library, I think, but I'm prepared to be corrected on that one. So we have that differences, but of course the difference that we're most interested in, the thing that I've been teasing you with all this time, is Shakespeare's signature. As we hear, it's one of six signatures that exist by William Shakespeare. Or that are attributed to William Shakespeare. I should probably be more accurate and say. So we've heard one already. That's the deposition in the court case, the Beloy Mountjoy court case over that marriage dowry. One exists here, of course. A third exists on a mortgage deed that's part of the same transaction. So the sale is agreed on the 10th, but on the 11th of March 1613, a mortgage is agreed as well. So we know that Shakespeare and his trustees paid, I think it gets right around, £80 up front, and then a mortgage for £60 later on. And the mortgage deed for that is in the British Library collection. And then the 3 other extant examples of Shakespeare's signature live in the National Archives, and they are all part of his last will and testament. So we can see on the bottom of the document there are 4 spaces for signatures. William Shakespeare's is here on the left. There's a gap there that should have been for John Hemmings, the other trustee. Who I don't know why he didn't sign this example. The name John Hemmings might be familiar to some as the force behind the first folio. They of course just called it the folio. And then we have William Johnson and John Jackson as the other signatories. I don't know why there are only 2 seals and why that third one isn't sealed. My presumption, but it is a presumption, is that it might have simply got lost. Because these things that does happen, but if there's another reason that someone knows, very happy to hear that. So that's the signature there, and we can see it in close up here. So what to say about the signature? The first thing is to say it's a slightly different handwriting than we're used to today. So this is known as secretary hand. It was common at the time, but some of the letter forms that are used in secretary hand are different than we use today. So we can probably quite easily make out. William is quite straightforward, despite the blot of the ink there. the William is fairly straightforward. The rest, I think, is quite a lot harder to read due to the different letter forms. In fact, it's had to basically squeeze it in this small box, long name, small box. There's this issue going on. So the S, I think, at the beginning is straight, it's quite forward, it's quite easy to see. Although faded is very recognisable, you can probably make out this S as well here. So for those at home, probably can't quite see the form. If you go sort of five letters in, there's a very faint kind of long S, looks a bit like an F without the cross bit going across. And then the P as well, all fairly recognisable. The other letters are a bit trickier. There's a very loopy H, an A with a very long upward stroke, and then there's right at the end, just on the edge as we get to the border, there's an E. It's to a modern eye, it's backwards and faded as well. I think it looks a bit like a figure of 8 or sort of an infinity symbol. That's how I spot that one. And there's the sort of the smallest glimmer of an R just kind of coming across the edge of the apartment there. And above that, there's a little kind of wiggly line. That line is showing that there's an abbreviation happening there as well. So the end of his name is being abbreviated. But even with all those letters, spelling is not familiar to us today. It's at the bottom of the screen there. It's sort of Shakespeare. We might pronounce it as that. And sort of intriguingly and interestingly to a modern eye, when we think of signatures as fixed and spelling as fixed, all 6 of the Shakespeare signatures spell his name slightly differently, and they are sort of comparable, but they're by no means identical either. I think we shouldn't read too much of this, but a lot of people have. As we've seen on all the maps and documents going through, spelling wasn't standardised at the time. Indeed, there's an early dictionary of 1604 gives 2 different ways to spell word, so it gives you an example of quite how free and loose people could be with their spellings. The signature, of course, is at the end of the document, and appropriate enough as well, it's at the end of the talk as well. So thank you all for your attention this afternoon. If you've come to us in person, or you've joined us at home, or anywhere else, of course, it might be from home. I hope that was sort of interesting. If there's questions you have, please let me know. I can answer them in person now or afterwards, as you prefer. What we'll do is we'll start with questions in the room, just to give people at home a chance to catch up. There's a delay on the stream, and I will also repeat the question because I'm not sure how well the microphone picks up the room, so people from home can know what we're talking about. So over to you. Are there any questions that I can answer at this stage? Yes.
Great talk.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned earlier that he rented that room from the Huguenots on Silver Street, I think it is.
Yes.
Can you remind me and us, I guess, apart from this deed, did he own other properties? Was the Bishopsgate his own, or was he also renting?
Yeah, so the question was, did he own other properties? So the only property in London that he owns is the Blackfriars one right at the end. I'll rephrase that. The only one we have evidence for him owning is the one at the end, but he does own property in Stratford upon Avon. So say he purchases new place in 1597. It's sort of one of the grandest of sort of dilapidated properties there. He buys the cottage opposite it soon afterwards. Again, the belief is that's probably for the servants at the house. He then actually starts to own land in Stratford. So he does invest. He's quite a sort of a canny businessman, as we heard, but his emphasis is in Stratford, where he's from, rather than in London. Thank you. Yes.
I believe that there was another covered theatre near the property that you owned in Blackfriars. Can you tell us anything about that?
That's right. So the question was there another theatre in Blackfriars? Yes, there was, called simply the Blackfriars Theatre. There's a bit of back and forth about whether it's going to sort of open up, but it finally opens in the last years of Shakespeare's life. And the main sort of thing about that was it was an indoor theatre, and it would be sort of a bit more upmarket than the Globe Theatre. So sort of famously the South Bank theatres, there's sort of a lot of they're for everyone. There's a lot of mixing of the classes, you might say, although there's obviously various ways to differentiate within that. They are kind of for everyone. It's a popular art form, less so with the inside theatres and the Blackfriars theatre in particular. You could charge more money for it effectively. Yeah. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Is there anything that links him to bucolic Islington? I know we've had Shoreditch, we've even had Chronicle Map.
Yeah.
Is there anything that pushes us in to this part?
So the question was, is there anything that links Shakespeare to Islington? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, who knows what he did in his spare time? He might have liked to go for a walk when he was thinking something through, but there's no documentary evidence that links him to Islington. Thank you. But this is me thinking this in real time. I suppose the question is, which way would he have headed north to Stratford? So he might well have passed through it on the way heading north, but that is something to follow up rather than any kind of definitive
Stopped at a well, maybe.
Yeah, stopped at a well. Yeah, who knows?
You can almost sense Clerkenwell and Smithfield in the works. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so again, it quite possibly they weren't far. He travelled to very likely, but we're always dealing with such sort of small fragments. So I hope so, but who knows? And it's always that thing of who knows what will be found. I should say, he says, his brain kicking back into gear. Perhaps not the more bucolic aspect, but the master. I'm trying to remember this now. It's in here somewhere. A little blue circle is turning. So there is a bit of a connection with Shakespeare to the I think it's called the Master of the Revels, the Master of the Rolls. That's probably not the right word to call it, but basically you had to register your play with the government. So these aren't the right terms, but in effect, you had to register your play with the government censor, and that was located, if you know Islington, near where St John's is today, near where the gate is there. So actually, yes, there's a good chance he would have been round that point at somewhere. I think that's one of those things lurking in my brain. So double check that, everyone. Don't take that as gospel, but I think that is the case. Yeah, thank you. Other questions from the room? Yes.
It's not a question.
That's okay.
Just connected to the theatre in Shoreditch, where it started.
Yeah.
If you Google Romeo and Juliet mural. There is a beautiful mural there, and that's where the theatre was.
Yes.
And there is also a statue of it. Not sculpture, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So, just for the benefit of the people at home, if you Google Romeo and Juliet mural, there's a mural on a pub where the theatre was, where the theatre, the capital T, the theatre was in Shoreditch. There's a really nice mural there, and there's a statue of Shakespeare nearby as well, which helps mark the location. I should say as well, the Curtain Theatre, another contemporary, was located around there as well, and there's been various archaeology that's been digging that up recently as well, which might be of interest to some of you as well. There's a question at the front.
I was just going to ask about that because I read that there was some archaeology going on, and that possibly there would be a Shakespeare museum there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. The question at the front was about the archaeology. I'm afraid I don't know the details, but it's Museum of London Archaeology that have been sort of leading on that, and they have published various things in there, both themselves and in the various kind of archaeological press. So if that's of interest to you, that's where you could follow that. Up. Yeah, thank you. Are there questions from home, Jack?
No, lots of nice comments.
Oh, yeah. Would I be rude if I said that's the best way? yeah, that's most appreciated. Are there any more questions in the room? And we'll give people like a couple more minutes in case there are questions from home. If anything like me, it can be hard to get your brain and kind of fingers engaged in time to do it. So very good. Yeah.
Susan asks, will we ever find out why he left his second best bed to his wife? Why not the best?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question was, will we ever find out whether he left his second bed best? I haven't answered that.
Yeah.
And the source I trust very much, but because my mum told me this once. So if it's wrong, take it up with my mum. But she isn't usually about these things. So I think we can be all right. So she told me that the idea was that beds were very big status symbols. Furniture in general, and beds in particular, were very big status symbols at the time. it was kind of a way, you know, think about those grand sort of 4-poster beds with all the curtains. Your best bed you might give to your guests. Your best bed would be your status thing. Your second best bed might actually be the one that you're kind of living and intimate with. So that might actually be the one that they have, one hopes, happy memories in. So that might be why. So as I say, if it's wrong, I'll give you my mum's email address. You can take it out. You can take it out with her. Are there any other questions? In which case, thank you again for coming along. It's a real pleasure to see you all. Cool. Oh, you're most welcome. You're most welcome. Glad you enjoyed it.